Well, in my book, What's Your Sales Story, the tagline is the Kaizen way of not letting your ego get in the way of your success. And I put that in there for a very specific reason. But first of all, we have to understand that as salespeople, we have to have a healthy ego. We get rejected day in and day out, day after day. We get more no's and yeses every single day. So if you don't have a good ego and a good healthy sense of self, then it's very hard to be successful as a salesperson. However, what happens and what trips people up is when their ego gets out of control and they fail to put their ego in check. For example, when I was a struggling sales rep, my whole attitude about selling was that it's all about me. My number one goal is to make as much money as possible and to get promoted as fast as possible. And I was willing to do anything to make that happen. So my typical sales calls were something like this. I would go in and say, Dr. Jones, I'm Jamar Brown with Company X. I have the best products, the best service. I want you to switch your business to my products today. And they would look at me and say, who are you? And I would say, well, I'm Jamar Brown with Company X. I have the best products, the best services. I need you to switch your products to me today. And now I got thrown out of a lot of offices, but from my perspective, that's what selling was all about. And my ego was so big that I couldn't get under control to understand that it's really important to understand the person's story that you're talking to and to leverage your own story. And there's one particular example which stands out above the rest, and that is with a good doctor of mine who's actually become one of my good friends, but back then was my nemesis, Dr. James Peace. And I would go into his office day in and day out, and I would always ask for more business, and he would always say no, and this was our recurring relationship for months. So one day I decided to go in there and change my approach. And I set up a preceptorship, which is a day where you shadow the doctor for the day and understand how they treat patients and how they interact with their staff. So I wanted to do this with Dr. Peace. Now, this particular physician always wears polo shirts and slacks. Didn't wear a suit or scrubs. So I figured I would show up, in a polo shirt and slacks to kind of mirror the doctor, which is what a lot of training programs teach us to do. So I go in there and I show up and I walk through this crowded waiting room with about 20 people, and I get to the back where the staff is. There's about 7 staff members and Dr. Peace. And I show up and I say, Dr. Peace, I'm here for my preceptorship. And he says, what are you doing dressed like that? I thought he was joking. So I said, I'm here for the preceptorship. I'm dressed like you. He said, I want you to go home and change. Still thinking he's joking, I said, Dr. Peace, help me understand this. I said, I'm dressed just like you. He said, when you come to my office, I expect you to be professional every time you show up, in a suit and a tie, button up. This is my place of business. You are dressed inappropriately. Go home and change. At that point, my ego kicked in because people were watching me. The patients in the waiting room are looking at this unfold, and I'm starting to get really, really, frankly, pissed off at Dr. Peace. And I say, Dr. Peace, how can I be dressed unprofessionally if I'm dressed just like you? And he just looked at me. He said, I'm not going to respond to that. All I can tell you is that if you go home and change and come back, we'll do the preceptorship. If you don't, have a nice life. See you when I see you. And he turned and walked away. So I was forced to walk back out through the waiting room with all these patients that had witnessed this experience. And of course, my ego is trying to protect itself. And I'm, cursing Dr. Peace in every single language I could think of, get out to my car, pounding the steering wheel. And I'm just frantic and upset because, I can't believe that I was treated that way. So I decided to go home. I said, forget it. And this was at the point where I actually thought about quitting. So I go home and I typed up my resignation letter to Allergan because I was going to quit. And before I did that, I decided to call my mother, who has always been the voice of reason. So I called my mother and I explained to her what happened with Dr. Peace and about how he mistreated me, how I couldn't believe he was treating me that way, and I was dressed just like him. And she said, son, let me ask you a question. What would happen if you change and go back to his office? Mom, you don't understand. I can't give him that satisfaction. He's already thrown me out. I'm not going to go back. And she said, well, if you think about it, it is his business, it's his office, it's his practice. You're trying to get business from him. And quite frankly, you're letting your ego get in the way of your sales success. So I hung up the phone, really upset with my mother, and I was pacing around my apartment. I had the resignation letter in my hand. and I was gonna mail it. I was gonna send it. But there was something about the words, son, don't let your ego get in the way of your success, that kept playing over and over in my mind. And after a while, I didn't fully believe what she was saying, but it struck a chord in me, and I decided to give it a shot. So I put on a suit and I drove back to Dr. Peace's office.